So hi everyone that is here. My name is Kim. I'm the host for today's event. And today we will be listening to Harry Nelson from SpecialEffect, who will be presenting how to design accessible games for players with physical challenges. And I'm going to let Harry present more about himself if he wants to do so. And you can take it away.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here and to be talking about my favorite subject, which is accessibility, because I'm just that kind of nerd that really loves settings in video games. So judge me as you will. So if I share my screen to get my slides up, is that okay? And
Absolutely
then I'll
fine.
sort of go through my introduction and my spiel. So if I do this, and hopefully everyone can now see my presentation. Okay, yeah, the big white special effect is on the screen.
Yes, I think so.
Fantastic. Okay, so just to quickly introduce myself. So yeah, my name is Harry Nelson. I work for the charity SpecialEffect, and we mainly help people with accessibility in video games, and I'll sort of go into a bit more detail about that in a second. Just to sort of preface this talk, I have designed it in a sort of a two-part way. So we do have a free online resource called the SpecialEffect Dev Kit, which is a website that has basically all of our accumulated knowledge from the past 12, 13 years condensed down into little videos specifically designed for game designers who have questions about accessibility. So real practical stuff, like if you have questions about how do I put remapping in my game, do I want contextual remapping or normal remapping? I've got QuickTime events in my game. How should I handle those? How can I make my menus more accessible? Those real kind of practical questions. The SpecialEffect Dev Kit will be a fantastic resource for you that you can, bookmark somewhere and just keep referring to as you're working on your projects and kind of going through your careers. So that sort of serves as one sort of pillar of this talk. And then this presentation hopefully will be available to download as well. Is going to answer some of the more sort of theory questions to go along with that. So, why you might put certain settings in, how to know if one setting is better than another setting, how to do accessibility without kind of breaking your game necessarily, and just try to answer some of those questions in a real simple way, again, so that hopefully you can refer back to it as you're working on accessibility throughout your sort of games and your projects. You can just refer back to it. So if you've got a question, you can either, if it's a practical one, the dev kit probably help you out, or if it's more of the sort of theoretical one, hopefully the talk will be able to really help you out with that. So if we carry on, so first of all, what is SpecialEffect? Who are we? Who am I? Why am I talking? Why do you care what I have to say on accessibility? So the official line is, SpecialEffect is a UK-based charity aimed at improving the quality of life of individuals with physical difficulties via innovative technology, which is a very fancy-pantsy way of saying that we help people with disabilities to play video games, and we also help them with other technology such as eye-controlled cameras, voice-controlled computers, telepresent robots, and all sorts of gadgets. But for the purposes of this, we help people with disabilities to play video games. It's a big part of what we do. And I could sort of try and explain what that all is, but I do have a lovely video because everyone loves a video. So hopefully this plays. And if there's any problems with it, please just do let me know.
Nobody likes being left out. That's why SpecialEffect are helping people with physical disabilities to play video games. But this isn't just about having fun. The gaming setups we create are personalised, so people can play to the very best of their abilities. And that opens the door to inclusion and independence, confidence and creativity. Help us level the playing field and create more magical gaming moments. Because it's everyone's turn to play.
So hopefully that video worked okay, if someone could give me a yes. Did that play okay for everybody? I can't see. So we are SpecialEffect, and as you can see, video games, helping people play video games is very much kind of what we do. As you can see on the left there, video games for all, that pretty much sums up what we try and do. This is our bread and butter. This is what we are doing, every single day of the week. It's what we've been doing every single day of the week for the past 12 years. I've been at SpecialEffect for just under 4. We've seen literally sort of tens of thousands of individuals with all kinds of conditions. And again, as you saw from the video, it's a very practical, hands-on approach, one-to-one with the individuals, helping them and figuring out and facing the difficulties with video games that they have. So just to try and give some sort of credence to sort of who I am and why you might be interested in my perspective, we do have that, physical hands-on experience of pretty much every condition under the sun and more or less every game as well. We do have some other projects as well. If they're of interest to you, we won't be talking about them in this talk, but they are available on the website if you do want to know more about them. And moving on, so I promise we'll move on to the good stuff later, but so this may be of a slightly more interest to you. So iGaze games, we do help to develop our own games as well. Specifically, we like making iGaze games. These are games that can be played with nothing but your eyes, using special infrared cameras. But this also represents that we do a lot of work with video game companies themselves and developers themselves. So we worked with everyone from your large AAA studios, your Call of Duties, your Battlefield, your Forzas, League of Legends, Sea of Thieves, your real big games, all the way down the scale to sort of indie people who are just doing it as a hobby after work, making their first Steam game. And again, we've got many, many years of doing that and advising on accessibility. So in terms of why you may want to consider sort of our approach on accessibility is, we've got that physical hands-on approach with the players, but we also work with the companies as well. We do also have several projects that we do, one of which is iMine, which is a completely iGaze interface that we developed in-house so that you can play Minecraft. We also helped to develop the Xbox adaptive controller and the Logitech adaptive Switch kit, if you've seen either of those. And then finally, this part is what I think will really help to be a good reference point for yourselves and any upcoming designers when it comes to accessibility that you can refer to in your own time. So we've been doing this for a long time, and we've seen a lot of people, and we've gained a lot of experience and information that we know can be quite difficult for other people to get. So we've actually created 2 different websites, one of which is the Game Access website, which is this one you can see here. And it's essentially a blog post where if you want to know what's the latest in accessibility, what's going on, we tend to have a breakdown of, the latest games. So there's Halo, what accessibility does it have? The new Sackboy game, what does that have? Breakdowns of the controllers, there's usually a little video. But if you just want to stay up to date with what's going on in accessibility, or if you're making a shooter and you want to check out what the other shooters have been doing, then the Game Access info site will probably be really good for you. There will be a link at the end of the presentation as well. And I have mentioned as well the SpecialEffect Dev Kit, which is that practical tool that I said would be a really good resource for you. So again, rather than me trying to explain it, I should have a little video that plays here.
The SpecialEffect Dev Kit is a new resource for game developers who are looking to improve the motor accessibility of their game for players. We created the Dev Kit to share with developers the specialized knowledge and experience the SpecialEffect team has gained from working directly with players, building an understanding of the barriers they face and options that can help, and to showcase the work developers have done to create innovative and accessible ways of interacting with the game using options they've provided. Even when using an adapted controller, players may still face barriers within games. Through a series of videos, the Dev Kit covers many of the motor accessibility options we look for when assessing how accessible a game might be to some players. We hope that by breaking things down in detail, we can show developers throughout the industry how they might create and implement some of these options into their own games, and why they might be useful for players. We hope in turn that this resource will help developers to continue improving motor accessibility for their players globally. If you're interested in adding motor accessibility options to your game or a future project, please visit the SpecialEffect DevKit website to get started at specialeffectdevkit.info.
So there's that resource that I spoke about that will be really helpful for those more practical questions. We will be going through it later in the talk. So by the end of this talk, hopefully you'll feel really, really confident in the decisions that you make when it comes to accessibility, and knowing, why and how you might be making certain decisions. So the first thing I want to actually touch on in this talk are some sort of common misconceptions when it comes to accessibility. Not necessarily misconceptions, but these are sort of thoughts, questions, general opinions that can sometimes crop up. And I feel that it can be quite difficult to kind of know how to navigate these, and what sort of the answer might be. There's never one true answer, but maybe make more sense. So the first one is, accessibility does not necessarily mean lowering the difficulty. I think this can be quite a big one. Usually a lot of fans of games can get the wrong idea about accessibility. They think you're just going to make the game super duper easy. It is necessary. Sometimes it can be helpful to lower the game, and we're going to talk about when and why you might do that. But it doesn't necessarily mean lowering the difficulty. Accessibility and difficulty are not the same thing. My rebuttal would be, a Dark Souls level difficulty is perfectly okay if players have sufficient tools to compete on even ground. So what I mean by that is, if you're going to set the difficulty to be really, really high, a lot of times this difficulty has been set and balanced against players who have access to sort of the whole controller, sort of like able-bodied players. And it's just about being aware that not all of your players will have access to the full controller. They might be only playing with, one joystick and 6 buttons or something like that. So putting in options that we'll talk about and that you'll see in the dev kit, things like remapping, things like auto aims, things like turning button holds into button presses, can have an enormous impact in increasing the accessibility and raising that player up so that they can compete on an even footing. It's not necessarily about making the game easier. It's not about making the player overpowered. It's giving them the sufficient tools so that they can compete on even grounds. That's the first one that I really just want to give you permission to. It's okay to make difficult games. The next one, you do not have to compromise the integrity of your game design. This can be another big one. Again, if we're talking about Dark Souls is meant to be difficult. It's famous for being difficult. If you were to put in vulnerability in a Dark Souls game, it's a high likelihood that that's going to compromise the integrity of the design, but not just from a philosophical sort of standpoint of what the game's about, but also from like a fairness standpoint. So my example is, not all accessibility features are appropriate all of the time. And a really good example of this is in the game Gears of War 5. If you may or may not have played Gears of War 5, but they have a fantastic sort of single stick mode in it, and one of the options is an auto aim. Auto aim is something that is in quite a lot of shooters these days. It's a fairly standard setting. However, Gears 5 auto aim is just on another level, especially if you're playing single player. This auto aim, you press a button and you are sniping alien heads from across the screen. It is fantastic. For somebody who just wants to play the game and get big guns and shoot big aliens, which is kind of the point of Gears of War, they're allowed to do that. They're able to do that easily and accessibly. They're doing it in single player. They're not bothering anybody with it. However, obviously something like that on online play would be completely broken. It's akin to an aimbot. And if you have somebody sniping people's heads around corners with an aimbot, you certainly don't need the Xbox lobbies with more people raging in it because they think somebody's cheating. It's an example that it's not appropriate. It's not always appropriate, and you will have to draw a line somewhere, and it's okay to draw that line somewhere. And then the third and final one, Not everyone will be able to play your game, and that's okay. I know that everyone's got a very, very kind heart, and we always want people to be able to play all of the games all of the time. But a lot of times what ends up happening is people will try to make so many accessibility features that they don't end up making one really good one, and they don't end up making ones that actually address the issues of the game. And one big problem with this is I'd say everyone is unique with individual challenges and solutions. And whilst you may be able to predict many of their needs, because you're smart game designers and you know your audience, you know your games, you can certainly predict lots of them. You will never be able to predict them all. Like I said, I've seen hundreds, if not thousands of individuals, and not one of them has ever been the same as someone else. You can take two perfectly, you take two twins, you play the same game, same condition. One of them is going to struggle with the menus and one of them is going to struggle with the buttons. I would, in fact, argue you'd be better off. It is often better to give players a flexible toolbox, I've got a thing in my way, so that they can adapt the game to their needs. And what this means is rather than you trying to think for the player and trying to imagine every possible scenario and putting in 900 different controller layouts, it's often better to put in something like really flexible remapping so that the player can adapt it to their needs. And as we go through this talk, hopefully you'll be able to see some examples of exactly what that means. But again, it's all about giving players the sufficient tools they need to be able to compete. And those tools should be flexible and controlled by the player. So moving on, we've heard a lot about what accessibility isn't. So what is accessibility in gaming? In a sentence, if I could summarize it, I would say accessibility is about making reasonable adjustments in order to grant players the tools they need to succeed. So again, there's that phrase of grant players the tools they need to succeed. So things like remapping, things like auto aims, all sorts of things that we'll discuss. But you can also see in large green writing reasonable adjustments. And if you take any sentence away from this talk, I hope it's this one. Because again, you will have to make decisions when it comes to this. I know everyone's got a very good heart and they want to make all the settings all the time, but it is very important. And there are genuine reasons why you might not be able to put certain settings in a game. One could be where you are in your development cycle. If you're very early days and you've got loads of time, you could build the entire game from the ground up with all sorts of amazing accessibility features, and that's fantastic. And we love that. But sometimes, you're 2 weeks from launch, or you may have already launched and the game's already out there. And it might not necessarily be appropriate to start tinkering with the fundamentals of the game. So it can limit what features you can put into your game. However, we've got an example later in the talk that can hopefully give hope to you if you have launched your game, or if you feel like, oh no, maybe it's a bit late. It's never too late to put accessibility features into your game. However, it is something just to be aware of. So do make sure that it's reasonable, that your time and resources allow you to do it. What genre of game you're making can be huge. The type of accessibility features that go into a platformer can be very different to those that go into a driving game or a shooting game. It's just something to bear in mind to make sure you're understanding what the challenge of your game is. So again, a Dark Souls game, it's about kind of like beating bosses. It's a very mechanical game. So you want to make sure that you've got accessibility tools that help with the mechanics of the game, because that's what players are likely going to struggle with. If you're making a puzzle game and the emphasis is on puzzles, you probably want features that allow players to do the puzzles and to help with the puzzles. And finally, and again, of the three, I'd probably say this is the most important, the purpose behind your game, i.e. why is someone playing it to begin with? This can be a very, very, very important one to remember. And this sentence is really going to help guide you when it comes to knowing what features are appropriate to put into your game and which ones might not be. So if you really understand your game, so again, a Dark Souls-like game, the point is not actually to beat bosses. People often go into a Dark Souls game knowing that they're going to die a lot. People go into a Dark Souls game knowing that they might not finish it. The point of a Souls game is not to beat the boss. It's to have that even footing. You want to go toe to toe. It's like the video game version of a boxing match. You want to have a fair fight and a fair chance. So when you're thinking of accessibility features, Again, you might not want to lower the boss's difficulty down because that's not what the game's about. You just want to make sure that you're raising that player up so that they've got a fair chance, they can compete on a fair chance. And equally, if you've got a game where the main directive is story, that's the main purpose, is to experience a story. Something like Celeste is a really good example of this. Celeste is, it's a lovely platformer game, and it's a really fun platformer game, and it's challenging. But the main heart and soul of Celeste is the story of getting up the mountain and having that personal journey. So if your main goal is story, then you may have more flexibility in lowering the difficulty and making things a little bit easier, and having things like invulnerability or slowing the pace of the game down or infinite jumps or something like that, because they didn't buy the game necessarily to have the challenge of platforming. They bought it to experience the story. So just keeping that in mind when you're thinking of, why is somebody playing this game? What is the goal? What did we promise them that they could do in the game? And just make sure that you've got settings in there that help players to achieve that. If nothing else, they can do that. So moving on. Accessible design, sort of questions to keep in mind while designing. So again, I said there's hopefully something you can refer back to as you go on along with the dev kit for the sort of practical stuff. But some questions I found that can be really helpful, again, when you're trying to figure out what setting should I put in the game, how do I know which one is right and which one might not be appropriate. So we'll start off with physical access. This is called inputs on the dev kit. But a good question I'd ask myself if I was designing a game: how will the player physically interact with the game? So this can be motion controls. Does it use motion controls? Does it have one joystick or two joysticks? Does it have 4 buttons or 32 buttons? And even with those buttons, are they button holds or are they button presses? Do you press multiple buttons at once? Do you tap buttons in quick succession, say like a quick time event or a sort of a Tekken fighting game combo? These are all things to bear in mind when you're thinking of physical access. How is the player physically going to press their buttons, manipulate their joysticks to interact with the game? And a question to sort of combo with this, I would say, is does it need to be this way or could it be optional? So if you've got motion controls, do you need to have motion controls? Or could there be an option to switch those off if a player found motion controls difficult? Do we need to use multiple joysticks? Or could we get a bit clever and a bit inventive and come up with a sort of single joystick mode similar to Gears of War 5? If we've got multiple buttons, if they're button holds, do they need to be button holds? Or could we make that into a tap? So for instance, sort of aim to hold the trigger down to aim is a common one, where it's quite common now to see that be able to be turned into, just tap it and it aims, and you tap it again, it stops aiming. Or sprinting is another one. So again, it can often be a good question just to come back to if you're not quite sure whether or not your buttons or your joysticks are quite working out. I find these are good questions to sort of ask yourself. Assistive tools and settings. This is probably what you're typically thinking of when it comes to accessibility. It comes under gameplay in the dev kit. So the question here is, what tools does the game provide to help players? So this is very much you as a designer get to sort of go wild with this one. That's the things like your remapping, your auto walk, auto aim, invulnerability, slowing the game down. But as well, a bit of crossover with the physical access stuff in terms of making the buttons easier to press. But you can really go to town, and the dev kit for this one in particular is going to be a fantastic resource for you if you've got questions about how do I do remapping, what is an auto walk, how do I know what sort of auto aim I want, those sorts of questions. We will have some examples later on though, so don't worry. But again, it's just a good question to keep in mind. What tools am I, the designer, giving the player so that they can elevate themselves up to meet the challenge that I've set them? And finally, cognitive access. How easily can players absorb the information they need to succeed? We won't be talking about this too much just because of time, unfortunately, but as you can see, it's things like well-designed menus, helpful UIs, colorblind modes, and those sorts of things. The thing I would like to say on this is the difference between helpful and clear. is just because something is very helpful doesn't mean it's clear, and just because something's clear doesn't mean it's very helpful. I often like to think of this as like men are often very clear. We will, well, at least I've been accused of saying the wrong answer very, very clearly, usually multiple times. I believe it's called mansplaining. As an option of being clear but not helpful. And usually I find that women the other way around, they have the right answer, and they know they have the right answer, and it's fantastic, but I have no idea what they're talking about. It's like, where are my keys? They're on the windowsill. There's 14 windowsills. So it can be important just to make sure, that when you're designing maps, when you're designing UIs, when you're designing menus, they may be very clear, but are they helpful? Or they may be very helpful, but are they clear? And that can change on the context. It can just change on what information does the player need at any given time. And just a final note on all of this to sort of bring it together. To say physical access, again, speaking of menus, one thing that we often see in menus is they often use like the shoulder buttons to go across the tab. That's quite a common one, R1, R2 to go from tab to tab. And again, that's one of those questions where I said, does it need to be this way, or could this be optional? Because if you've got a game where the gameplay is, the 4 face buttons and a joystick, say a platformer, and then you suddenly get to say a shop and an inventory of some kind, and you suddenly need the shoulder buttons, and you don't need them for anywhere else in the game, you've just turned your 4-button game into an 8-button game, and really they could be optional. And that's an example of a tool that you could put in, the option to make that either remappable or do your menus via a joystick, which could help with the physical access, but it also will help people navigate those menus. So hopefully there's just some questions that you can come back to if and when you ever get stuck. We talked a lot about assisted modes. Games do it in all sorts of different ways. There's Celeste in the top left corner there, again, story games. So they have the game speed, the infinite stamina, the air dashes. Mario, they got their regular mode and assist mode, up as a line. There's all sorts of different ways, and I do encourage you to have fun, sort of going around, seeing what other people have done, seeing how it might apply to your game. But one of the big questions that I receive quite a lot, especially from designers and developers, is how do I know which sort of setting is better than this one? If I've got 7 buttons, is it better to have 7 buttons or 2 joysticks? Is it better to have 1 button hold or 3 button presses? It's that kind of information that I find it can be very difficult if you haven't had that hands-on experience with disabled gamers, to know the answer to that. And not only to know the answer, but to feel confident that you're making a confident decision. So with this being a gaming talk, and anything gaming related cannot exist without it, I have a tier list of this is very, very vague. By no means is it word of law, but it's just something that can hopefully guide you through making some of those decisions. So if you are currently working on a game or working on a project, please put it in your mind now, just as we're going through the controls, and see whereabouts you might fall and how you might necessarily put yourself up the tier list. So we're going to start off with that S rank, a single button press, by which I mean press A to activate A. I don't necessarily just mean one button. You can have multiple buttons, but what I mean is that you don't have to hold it, you don't have to double tap it, you just press the button and it does the thing. Almost everyone will be able to have access to that, especially if they've got enough time to get around the buttons, if they struggle with timing. But a single button press is S tier. We love that. Single joystick or mouse, somewhat along the same lines. Again, thinking back to menus, anything that they're going to need the joystick to move their character anyway. So anything that can utilize that single joystick is fantastically helpful. And then there's combining the two together, joystick mouse plus a single press. Effectively what this is describing is you move your mouse and you do a single left click, not a double click, not a drag, just a single left click. And moving the mouse and a single left click is eye gaze. That's how eye gaze works. So this S rank, there are very, very, very few people on the earth who would not be able to gain at least one of these as an access method. So if you can aim for these, please just think about trying to, or at least, like I said, adding the options, creating that toolkit for players. And we're going to go through an example later. Now I'm actually going to skip over the B tier, the A tier, and go straight to B, because the difference between holding a button and pressing a button is actually very significant. Because if you think about just pressing a button, that's one thing. But let's say you have cerebral palsy and you have sort of involuntary movements, it's very hard to control your body. Then not only do you have to get to the target the first time, you then have to keep yourself on target, which can be extremely difficult for people. Or if you have something like motor neuron disease, where you have extremely weak fingers, extremely weak muscles, it can just be physically tiring to hold a button. It can be painful to hold a button. So it is a significant difference. Again, if you have button holds and you can put the option to turn them into single presses, that will dramatically increase the accessibility of your game. Double press buttons, so this is sort of double clicking a button. It's about on the same sort of bar as a single press. Different people prefer different ones, but they fall about the same. Again, if it could be a single press, or at least the option to have a single press, it's likely to significantly increase the accessibility of your game. Again, same thing. Again, dramatically below those is pressing 2 buttons at a single time. It doesn't sound that hard, but I assure you, just from experience, it is a very, very, very challenging thing for people to do. At least people with physical challenges. It can be extremely difficult. So anything you can do to alleviate that, to even turning it into a button hold, is probably better than having 2 separate buttons to do it. But again, options, toolkit, the option to change that would be fantastic. Down into E tier, we got 2 joysticks. I know that a lot of games, it's kind of unfair because a lot of games sort of require 2 joysticks just by default. However, manipulating a joystick is significantly harder than manipulating buttons. Not only do you need to get your hand or whatever body part onto the joystick, you then need to have the accuracy and control to not only move the joystick, but to move the joystick in the direction that you want, to keep it held in the direction you want for the time that you want, and then also release it at the correct time, which is hard to do. It's difficult to do with 1 joystick. Trying to do it with 2 at the same time, where you might be going in opposite angles, is very, very, very difficult indeed, especially if you then need to push buttons with it. So again, anything you can do to alleviate 2 joysticks. So just an example of trying to get down to a 1 joystick. A lot of times the right joystick is mainly used for the camera. So a good trick to help with this is having camera accessibility features that can sort of auto center the camera behind your character. We're going to see an example of that later. It can be a fantastic way of just, even if it doesn't alleviate the second joystick entirely, it can help to reduce the importance of it. So it's not necessarily so much of a challenge so much of the time. As you probably guess, 2 joysticks, single press. Again, trying to do 2 joysticks and 1 button at the same time is even harder than just doing 2 joysticks. And finally, down the F tier, multiple button press and holds. So this is pressing 2, holding 2 or 3 buttons down at the same time, is exceptionally difficult. You often see this with like radial menus, where you might have to say hold a trigger button to bring up the radial menu, and then press another button to select the item you want, and then press another button to confirm it or to go into a sub menu or something like that. And you end up pressing 2 or 3 buttons, or holding 3 buttons and using a joystick all at the same time, which can be very, very, very challenging. Again, as you can see from the tier list, anything you can do, if you can turn some of those into just single presses or have the option to, you can skyrocket your game in terms of accessibility and make it significantly more accessible for players. 2 joysticks and multiple button press and hold. You can probably tell that was going to come next. Again, just adding it all together is going to be harder. And finally, if you've got 3 joysticks, you're doing it on purpose, and I don't know why. But yeah, that is kind of it. So hopefully this serves as a fun little reference for you to come back on, and when you're looking at the controls in your game, when you're having a think of them, and what one you might want to turn it into, what options you might have. This may be hopefully helpful to you as a sort of reference point. So we've talked a lot about settings and a lot about what to do, but it can be very hard to visualize what that looks like. So here we have Lucy, lovely Lucy. She is, as you can see, she has a C6 spinal cord injury. She has no movement in her fingers, but she has good shoulder movement, what's called gross movement. So her arms and her wrists and everything, like the larger parts of your body, she's got good control over those. And she wants to play Tomb Raider and Zelda. And so you can see with her hands on her controller. So I picked Lucy because she's got a C6 spinal injury, which is a fairly, all spinal injuries are extremely serious. As far as, it's a fairly middle of the road spinal injury. It's a good sort of, if you were thinking spinal injury, Lucy would be a good candidate for the type of person that you'd commonly see. But you can see there, she's playing relatively well with a controller. She can, even though she can't use her fingers, she actually puts the joysticks in the palm of her hand. So she's got 2 joysticks and she can do most of the face buttons. But for her, the shoulder buttons are an absolute no-go. So if you remember earlier in the talk, I was saying how, sometimes randomly in menus, there's just randomly uses the shoulder buttons. For someone like Lucy, that would just be an end to her game. And if the menus to get into the game require the shoulder buttons, then she's a prime example of somebody who probably could play the actual game, but they might be getting barred by the menus simply because they can't access those shoulder buttons. So for someone like Lucy, the ability to remap is absolutely huge because she, like I said, she can get a good portion of the controller already. So just being able to maybe put those 4 shoulder buttons into the D-pad maybe could grant her a lot of access with remapping. So things like that would be fantastic help for Lucy. So next we've got Brian. Absolutely love Brian. Big smiling Brian. Big fan of Brian. You should love Brian. We all love Brian. He's got Duchenne muscular dystrophy. He's got very limited movement and strength in his fingers and kind of his whole body really. And Brian wanted to play Forza, FIFA, Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty. So he wants to play them all, man. He's not being stopped by anything. Brian is down to game. He wants to game. So again, we're going to sort of go through some of those challenges, and we saw Brian. So here's a look at sort of the beginnings of his setup when we were working with him. So we've got a few switches sort of velcroed in his hand. So he gets access to sort of 3 or 4 switches there. But you can see on the controller, he's struggling quite a lot with that joystick. And in terms of the second joystick, Brian is a prime example of someone where it's really not going to work. He's going to really struggle to get that second joystick. But there's a chance he could get the 1 joystick. So we actually went back with a new design, and you can see this is working out quite a lot better. So he's actually got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 switches. So he's got 1 on each hand and 4 on the little tray. So he's got 6 buttons, and you can see that he's pinching that joystick much more comfortably between his finger and his thumb. And so so he's now got a single joystick and 6 buttons. That's a good amount of the controller. That's a joystick, all of the face buttons, and 2 extra, which is plenty of games. That's FIFA for sure that he could do. That's Forza for sure that he could do. And again, when you think of those other games, if you could have a single stick mode, would be amazing for Brian. It would be a world of difference that's the difference between him playing Call of Duty and him not playing Call of Duty. I know it can be quite difficult to understand, but when I was saying about the importance of just how much difference a button press can make over a button hold. So if you see some of the buttons under his finger, let's look at that yellow one under his little finger, you can see how that might be quite hard to spam repeatedly, or it might be quite hard to hold it down. So being able to minimize the amount of buttons you need overall, which can be done with clever remapping, it can just be done with very clever design. It can be done with being thoughtful about how many buttons you're using, how often you're using them, making sure if in different contexts you might use the same button, getting the most out of each button. But also it's a prime example of someone where two joysticks would be a hurdle, and those button differences, those button holds can make a huge difference. So finally, I'd like to tell you the story about Sea of Thieves. We are coming to the end of it now. So hopefully, Sea of Thieves is one that we worked with, and hopefully you're fairly familiar with Sea of Thieves. If you're not, it's a game about, you get to be a pirate, travel the seven seas, and have pirate adventures. And they asked for help with their accessibility. We've been working with them for a long, long time. And when we first were talking to them, if you've played Sea of Thieves when it first launched, if you play it now, actually, by default, almost all of the interactions in the game, you actually have to hold the button down to interact with it. If you want to load a cannonball, you have to hold Y. If you want to lower and raise the anchor, you have to hold X. And the reason they did that was because the animation took that long. It just felt thematic, which is absolutely fine. I totally get that. However, as we sort of discussed, it would significantly increase the accessibility of the game if they could be button presses. This is something that we spoke to them about. So Sea of Thieves, in their attempt to reduce hold to interact as one of their settings, so now it's tap to interact is something that they added as an additional option. Like I said, by default, it's still the same hold, but you can go into the settings and you can change this if it's something that makes it more comfortable for you, which if we think back to Brian and we think back to Lucy, this is a setting they would definitely make use of. So for tasks such as digging chests, putting in the cannonballs, raising, lowering sails and anchors, you can now do all of that with just a single button tap, which takes it from our sort of C tier straight up to the S tier, a significant increase in accessibility with a very, very, very small setting change. Here we go. Radial menus is something that they had. And if you remember, that was something that was kind of right down in the F tier of very, very, very challenging to do, pressing all those multiple buttons. So they actually had a really comprehensive way of breaking this down. So they came up with sticky radial items. And what that means is they first made it so that you can operate it with a digital input, so not necessarily the joystick. So if you found buttons easier than a joystick, you could use buttons, so the D-pad, to operating it, or any other keybinds, as you can see there. So you could keybind and remap the button you use to access the menu. They also made the radial a toggle, so you can press the menu button once, you can go and make a sandwich, and you can come back and it's still going to be open, whereas before you had to hold it down. Again, so someone can press it, completely take their hand off the controller, and have all the time in the world to get over to another button to select the item that they want. It gives them plenty of time, helps to reduce those button inputs, so it goes from that F tier of multiple buttons being pressed all the way up to that S tier of just a single button press. So an enormous difference in accessibility, absolutely huge. And finally, sticky radial items. So again, there used to be a kind of confirmation where you'd highlight which one you want, but you have to hold the joystick over the one that you want. So what they did is they changed that so you toggle it once, and again, you could go away, make a sandwich, go to bed, come back, and you're still going to be highlighted on the one that you want, which again takes it from holding a joystick, holding multiple joysticks and multiple buttons, straight up to that S tier of you just move the joystick and then you press a single button and you're good to go. So they kept the radial menus for all normal, normal players who's playing by default. They're playing with the normal default settings. These are all in the accessibility menu. They are options. They are tools that the developers have given the players to allow them to overcome these particular challenges in the game. And finally, single stick. Sea of Thieves is a classic two joystick game. As we saw, two joysticks is very difficult for someone like Brian, very, very difficult. So they implemented a single stick mode. And again, I sort of mentioned this, but having the camera sort of follow you around. So that's something they did. So as you're walking around, let's say you get a bit stuck and the camera goes a bit wonky, every couple of seconds, the camera is just going to auto center behind the player. So even if you get really, really stuck, you're always going to get auto centered, so that you're only ever stuck for a second or two. They made it so that any prompt, so that you don't have to look down on the floor. If there's a treasure chest at your feet and it says press X to loot, you no longer have to tilt the camera down to look at it. Instead, you get the prompt in the middle of the screen because you're in the area and it says, hey, there's a treasure chest, press X. And finally, the ability to float in water. So you can't necessarily swim, but if you do fall off your boat, you fall into the sea, you don't just immediately drown. You actually auto float so that you can get back to your boat, get back to doing your pirating. Which, if you remember back at the start of the talk, I mentioned how important it is to remember why people are playing your game to begin with. And in a game like Sea of Thieves, you're playing it to go on a boat and go on adventures and be a pirate. And so you can actually see at the bottom of this here, they had to make some, they had to draw the line somewhere. So, you can't strafe left and right with this because the camera follows you around. You can't look up and down. You can't necessarily dive deep into the ocean because it wasn't reasonable at the time. It wasn't possible at the time to do that. However, somebody who buys Sea of Thieves, somebody like Brian, who's got one joystick and a few buttons, they can turn those holds into button presses so they're less tiring. They can take the two joysticks and turn them into one joystick, and he can be able to play Sea of Thieves. He can be a pirate. He can do the thing that the game said he can do. He might not necessarily be able to do it all, but he can do the vast majority of it, and he can do the main point of the game, which is to sail his boat around with his friends and have a jolly good adventure and not get stuck and drown in the sea doing it. So again, just some fantastic stuff that took it from, that sort of E tier of two joysticks all the way up to S tier with very, very, very sort of simple, quite small changes, but they can make an enormous difference. And finally, I've mentioned the dev kit quite a lot in this talk, and you're probably thinking, okay, what is it? So this is just one modules or one video from one module. So this is from module 2, which is action mapping, and this is just a short video for contextual mapping. So you're probably saying, I feel more confident with accessibility now. I feel like I understand why I want to make certain changes, but what changes do I want to make? What do they sort of look like? So this is where I'd say, please, please, please do look at the dev kit. There will be a link at the end of this. And, I can just let it play, and hopefully you can see that it would be a really helpful resource to you.
(2.7) Contextual mapping. Allow players to remap for each context in a game, where possible. During a game, the set of actions available to a player may change depending on the context the player is in. These contexts can be anything like driving a vehicle, attacking or defending in a sports game, or even being in a menu. So, for example, in Overwatch, while playing as Reinhardt, you're able to hold up a shield with one input or charge forward with another. But if you then switch to a different character, although some actions like jump will still be available, the overall set of available actions, and therefore the context, has changed. You could have global mappings for actions that are shared between contexts, but then allow players to remap for each context as well. So in Overwatch, it's possible to assign actions globally, but then also override these by changing the action mappings for each character individually. Ghost Recon Breakpoint allows players to remap based on the contexts they find themselves in, such as being on foot or in a vehicle. Menus should also be considered a context. Dark Souls Remastered allows you to remap many of the actions available while navigating the menu. Slay the Spire does the same, while also allowing you to remap Confirm and Cancel to any input. This module is a part of action mapping. Discover other modules in this topic on the SpecialEffect DevKit website at specialeeffectdevkit.info.
So there you go. That was an example of the dev kit. Like I said, it's a full breakdown of basically 12 years of special effect experience. And I'm pretty confident there'll be a module for the questions that you have. But thank you so much for listening to my talk. I hope that it went well, that you're able to see and hear the videos okay. And as promised, there's links to the dev kit, to game access info, Sea of Thieves, my email as well as special effect email. And hopefully this will be available to download somewhere from someone. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I guess we'll go to questions if anybody has any questions. Hopefully somebody does. If I come back here.
Hi, I'm back. I'm going to join the stage as well. Try to admin this. I see that we have 10 minutes left of the session, just so everyone knows. It will auto stop when we reach that. Funnily enough, most of the Q&A questions that are here are mine, because I think this is a really interesting subject and wasn't taught many of these things in school. So I don't know if you can see the Q&A questions. There is a tab.
Oh, yeah.
You can maybe look through and see if you find something that you want to answer, and I can show it on the stage.
Yeah. I guess if I do your first one, a problem I've seen a lot.
There you go.
Should we have a look at this one? Okay, so what's this? A problem I've seen a lot is that small teams don't include accessibility tools due to time constraints. Do you have any thoughts on this standpoint? Yes, indeed. This is something that comes up quite a lot. Obviously, time and resources. It is limited, and as I mentioned in the talk, you do have to make those decisions. I'd say the answer for this is to it's what we probably refer to as sort of low-hanging fruit. It's things that you know that you could do quite easily. So say like a single stick mode or adding multiple difficulties to a game is a really big challenge that you might not have time for. But perhaps going through the game and just seeing, okay, how many of these buttons are hold buttons and do they necessarily need to be? Because that's often something, like I said, depends on your game and your team. But that's often something that you could usually crack out in a couple of days or a week or so if you just go through and say, yeah, we could have an option to turn this into a button press, and as you saw, you don't necessarily need the world's best accessibility features and completely blow everyone's minds. Just really simple, practical, changing those button holds in Sea of Thieves to button presses is the difference between someone like Brian being able to play and not being able to play. So just going for that quite simple stuff. You don't need to blow everyone's mind every single time. It's perfectly okay to just do simple stuff if that's all you've got time for.
Fantastic. Now I have something to tell everyone at Twitter about that. Perfect. Any other questions you feel like you want to answer?
Since we just did one of yours, should we do one of the IGDA? I can't see who said it. We've mostly focused on minimizing. Is that?
There you go.
So it's mostly focused on minimizing, but what about add-ons, e.g. when you play Hades with PS controller? If you put the controller down, the game pauses. Are there any extras that are good examples that make game more accessible? I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, unfortunately.
Because if Viv wants to join the stream and tell us a little bit about it, she's available. Maybe not.
Sorry, I'd love to answer it. I'm just not entirely getting it.
I can ping her and we'll see if she can. Oh, sure, here she is.
So the question is basically, usually, like you were talking about having the button presses minimize the number of button holds and everything to the point that it's a button press. So we're mostly talking about reducing things to a simple form. But what about things that you add on purpose that usually wouldn't be a thing? Which is why the example about Hades, because specifically when you play Hades, the specific one is you have to be using the PS controller. It doesn't work with other controllers. But if you have a PS controller and you are playing with it, when you put the controller down mid-combat, the game pauses. It just pauses, so you can just drop it and walk away and come back. So if your hands are tired or something, or you have cramps and you just drop the controller, you don't wind up losing the game at that point because you dropped the controller. So this is a complete extra that is not expected to be there. And when you discover it's there, it's kind of really nice.
Yeah.
Are there any examples of things like that that have been built into games that we don't necessarily know about that are good examples?
Yeah, very much so. So again, with the dev kit, this will probably come under gameplay rather than inputs. But there's all sorts of examples. So I mentioned Celeste. So Celeste has the ability to slow the entire game down. So if you struggle with those platforming, there's another game on Steam that has it called Ninja Pizza Girl, which is a fantastic game. It really is good. I highly recommend it. But that allows you to slow the game down completely as well. So this comes under those sorts of clever things that you can do. Again, I spoke about the Gears 5 auto aim. There's traditional auto aim, but they really went above and beyond and made this thing, freakishly good, surprisingly good. And in terms of clever little extras that you can do, it does depend very much on your game. So something like auto pausing the game, that is really, really nice. That's a lovely little extra. Something Gears of War did as well is when you first load into the game, if you've got an adaptive controller plugged in, it actually pops up and says, hey, I see you're playing with this controller. We've actually got some accessibility settings that you might want to check out. And it will take you to the accessibility settings, talk you through them, and then take you to a sort of trial like space where you can try them out and see if any of them work for you. So that's a really nice extra feature. The Last of Us has quite nice features in terms of Ghost Recon as well, in terms of how the AI reacts to you in the game. A lot of the game has a bit of sneaking going on, and there's options to change that behavior to make it a bit more comfortable for you. So there's all sorts of really, really clever things you can do. When I was saying, have fun thinking them up, I think this is a really fun space for designers to be creative and really come up with something new that grabs people's attention, that people are going to be stealing from your game because you thought up this really cool thing. But yes, I did focus a lot on minimalism, you're right. But indeed, adding extras that can help elevate the players can have a huge impact, a huge impact as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
I hope it did too, but it was very informative and interesting either way. So we have 3 minutes left. We might have time for one more super short answer, maybe?
I can try. Is there a question? I mean, all the other questions are you. So is there a question that you want to answer?
Well, I do want to know, like, how do you think we can change the general environment of adding accessibility as a afterthought, rather than have it as a core idea in game design? Because that's how I learned it, and I think that's wrong.
Well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily. I would probably disagree that it's wrong, because it depends on your timing. Although I do agree. I think it is. You have a lot more options open to you if you do it from day one, and because you can design levels. So a really fun one, actually, also answering the other one, is the new Sackboy game. A lot of the levels, the levels match the sound, like the music are in time with the levels, which you don't actually think is much of an accessibility feature, but it's so much easier to platform when everything has the steady beat. So it's just a fun little way that they clearly thought from day one, how could we make this make sense to people? How can we make this accessible to people? In terms of changing that sort of thought process, I honestly think it's to encourage teams and developers to have fun with it, to really stretch their wings with it and not see it as this chore that they have to do as an afterthought. To really think about, like I said, have a look at the Sackboy levels. They are fantastically well designed. They guide you through them in a way that just doesn't feel like you're being guided, and yet the music, the rhythm, the things in the background are all helping you get through this level effortlessly. And to encourage people to have that creativity, so that that they can think about these problems, and they can have that opportunity to be the person to show them. And I think when we see more games that that are clearly designed from the ground up like that, I think they stand out quite a lot. You can tell when it's added on at the end, and you can tell when it was designed. And I think we see more games like that. It's going to stand out. People are going to notice, and more people are going to copy it. So I think make a name for yourself doing it.
And that's the session. Wow, that sucks. But thank you so much, everyone. I hope you can still hear me. Thank you, Harry, so much. Everything will be available online. I have 5 seconds to say this, but it was obviously super fantastic.